3D shapes or forms have height, width, and depth, unlike 2D shapes, which only have height and width. And 3D shapes just having depth open up an entirely new world for not only drawing, but how you should be thinking in general for art. Last video I said everything can be drawn with 2D shapes, and for 3D shapes, you can 2 times that, as well as 2 times the way your art will look when you practice them. From cars to anatomy to helping with poses, even shading. Studying up on these will indirectly help all aspects of your art. I said this is going to be a thorough series, assuming you do not know how to draw any of these shapes mentioned. So when I'm talking about the shapes, I will show clips of ways to draw them instead of completely trying to explain it. Enough talk about how great they are though, and how much they'll help. I'm gonna go over them and tell you how to use them. Before getting into actually drawing the shapes, there are some things you need to know beforehand that can help you visualize and actually execute practicing better. Starting with being perfect. If you want perfect shapes, perfect sizes, just everything perfect in general, you will need to know perspective. Which one will be best for you in the scenario you want to use it in? And to be honest, that is a lot of work. And drawing perfect shapes really only helps you when you're drawing a setting or a background, because you can directly follow a perspective grid. But for people posing and just general practice, your shapes do not have to be perfect. So do not stress if one side of the square is a little bigger than the other. Once you're building on the shapes and making the forms into identifiable things such as the face, chest, and arms, the goal is to get the idea out of your head and onto the page. Second, even though it doesn't have to be a perfect perspective, drawing shapes at angles, especially ones with parallel lines, the lines should line up to a vanishing point. Second before last, planes. Planes are indicators for whatever side of the shape you're looking at. It makes it easier to see each side of the shape and definitely helps with shading later on. And I also use them to determine the direction of what I'm drawing. Lastly, contour lines that follow the shape and help visualize it in an actual 3D form. And those are the main things I really wanted to go over. When sketching, you don't have to be perfect, but you should use some references just to know when something looks off. And I'm sure you probably heard this for the 30th time already, but you know, references help, especially in situations like these. But let's get into the meat and potatoes of the video. Cubes can be drawn in endless amount of ways, but I'm going to start with the way I learned way back when I was just, you know, a jit. Pretty much you would draw 2 squares like so and connect the corners to the corresponding square. Easy enough. From here on, since I've been doing art, I'll start to draw boxes in other ways, but this is the most practical way to place a box in terms of wanting to pose a character or have more control over the position overall. First and foremost, you should study this sheet. I'm sure you've seen this before. Even if you know boxes, it doesn't hurt to do more practice. But secondly, the way I draw boxes is I start with the plane I want the subject to be facing. So like, for example, say I want the person looking up. I draw the plane like this, and I know I'm going to be seeing a little bit of the side of their face and the underside because of the angle I'm going for. So I draw the side plane and the underplane. And that same process is for every time I'm setting up the scene, at least when I'm using cube. It also helps for me to imagine what it would look like if I had a box right in front of me. Sometimes I'd use dice maybe, or just something around me that can help me visualize it. Cubes and like rectangles are pretty much drawn the same way and can be used to draw a lot of things, you know, like the head, the body. But when I was getting into digital art, this video goes over how to draw boxes in its entirety, very in-depth, and helped me a lot. And it's only specific to that shape, so if you are curious, you can watch that. Spheres are the most used and the easiest to use, and it's all really the same concept as the cube, but there are 2 ways I use to draw a sphere. They both start off with just drawing a circle, but what makes them different is the guidelines. One follows the shape of the sphere on the circle and using the same idea of imagining where I want the subject to face. So I'll end up drawing it in that direction. And the other version of the guidelines is where I don't follow the shape and I just draw a line to mimic the plane. Now these lines act as simple guidelines of the face, so I like to add my other guidelines directly in the middle to just map out my eyes, nose, mouth, you know, the facial features, just to know where they would be for later on. The 2 methods are really just more preference depending on how you draw your face. But I will warn that it's easy to mess up proportions with the one that curves and follows the shape as opposed to the other one. Cylinders are similar to spheres and are very straightforward. You want to start with the base of the cylinder. You need to know which way you want to place it, but just to make it simple, say I want to draw an arm. I know that the arm muscles have to be downward and isn't flat, so I draw a line and just imagine this line is wrapping around to form the base of the cylinder, which would in turn be the sides and behind the arm. Then at the corners of the circle we just draw for the cylinder, I draw parallel lines lines following whichever proportions I'm trying to meet. At the end of the lines, I'll repeat what I did from the start. And it's the same process for any direction, as long as you can imagine where the base of the cylinder is and where you want it to meet the other base of it. This is also where at the beginning of the video I said the vanishing point. You just want to make sure those lines at some point meet an invisible vanishing point if you want to be accurate. Cones exist. I don't use cones that much at all, but for the sake of the video, cones are like cylinders, just the base is the same circle, oval shape, and the opposite base is a point. So imagine drawing a cylinder, but the wall lines converge at a certain point to meet and, well, make a point. If you notice, a lot of the shapes are corresponding with each other. So each time you study one, a little bit of it helps with the next thing you want to learn. And in turn helps you pick up other skills like perspective drawings and backgrounds with just a little bit more ease. Now that you know how to draw these shapes, while you can use them in effective ways separately, in order to make all the cool things you see, you're gonna want to know how to put them together, which is called construction. And that's just where you put a couple of shapes together to make a more, identifiable object, but still simple. That's why you see many artists start with basic sketches. It's easier to build up from shapes instead of going full detail at the start. This is where you need to be very imaginative and remember that what you're drawing on the page is taking up space within that page. Pretty much starting to think in 3D. For example, like the arm we were talking about. When I was talking about drawing the base and imagining it wrapping around behind and being the sides of the arms, that's the type of thought process you need to have with everything you draw. And the more you think of it like that, the faster you'll grasp other things that you just haven't even studied yet. It just won't take you as long to cross that gap. Don't just practice to practice, you need to learn to think in 3D. That's why you're learning to draw these shapes. It's not about knowing how to actually draw a cube. I'm sure if you really tried for the first time, you can draw a cube. It's about knowing when to use a cube, just knowing the purpose of it, when to use it, what are you trying to see, and what are you trying to simplify. You want and need to build a library of shapes to easily recall and apply what you learned to something you're doing and or learning. It all stacks up, and even an unsuccessful piece, learning this, attempting to understand it at any phase in your art journey is still a successful practice. That's all I can really say for 3D shapes. Just as a final note, there's many ways to actually practice drawing the shape, and me explaining them like how I did could have helped you, could have not helped you, but there are literally tons of sheets out there that you can just copy from, reference from, trace over if you need to, if you really are having a difficult time understanding it. I even now go back to old sheets that I used to draw just to redraw and refreshing up on what I used to do. Like, the learning never stops. I can have a completely different way of drawing every single shape I named like next week. So yeah, find your own process, study as much as you can. In the next video, I will be doing a more in-depth guide on actually using the shapes for anatomy so you can just see what it looks like instead of me explaining the actual shape. But I didn't want to compact all that into one video and then like overload. That's just a lot. But I'll most likely be using 2D and 3D shapes. So yeah, anyways, hope this helps. That's it.